Hey guys, MichaelBtheGameGenie here. Today we're going to be talking about some NES games that are actually better than the arcade games they were made from.
Goodbye.
So if you guys have been following me for the last little while here on YouTube or on my social media, you'll realize that I've become completely infatuated with the idea of having a home arcade and arcade games in general, whether it be buying one, building a little mini home arcade, different aesthetic things. It has completely taken over all my interests. But realistically, even I'm not oblivious enough to realize that arcades aren't everything. And in fact, there are some ports of arcade games that made it to home consoles that are actually much better than the arcade games they were made from. Today we're going to be taking a look at a couple of these games from the NES where the ports are actually much better than the arcade games themselves. Of course, this is just my opinion. I'm not stating they were technically better or whatever, just how I feel about them. Anyways, let's take a look at the games. This is a softball to start, really. When someone says Ninja Gaiden, almost 100% of people will immediately think of the NES game. However, there was a very cool arcade game that came first, and of all the games we are going to compare today, these are the most drastically different. I have a lot of fond memories of Ninja Gaiden Arcade, as it was one of the only games in the community center by my house. I grew up in the 80s, so anything with ninjas immediately grabbed my attention, plus some of the bad guys in the first stage and in the opening cinematic were wearing Jason Voorhees looking hockey masks. So Kid Mike was all in, and I played it a bunch. And by played it a bunch, I mean I fed it a lot of quarters, because one thing that the arcade game has in common with the NES game is its difficulty. Ninja Gaiden Arcade, however, is not what most people would expect, as it is a side-scrolling beat-em-up. Yeah, you heard me right, if you aren't familiar with it, so the gameplay is completely different. I would put my quarter into the cabinet and hit the streets and start thrashing these bad guys. Not for very long though, because it's kind of difficult getting used to how the combat works, and it's not as intuitive as some of the more popular arcade beat-em-ups like TMNT or Final Fight. It's really easy to get hit, and you have to work extremely hard to get in a position to attack your enemies. On top of that, there are power-ups and weapons scattered throughout the stages in breakable objects, but you have to knock or throw your enemies into the objects to break them. Again, it has to be difficult, right? For those who hate beat-em-ups because they don't provide a challenge, you might like this one because this isn't just a beat-em-up you can quarter up your way through. When you die and continue, you don't start right at the spot that you left off, but you will return to either the beginning of the stage or at a checkpoint throughout. One amazing thing about dying is you get to see the really cool continue screen. There may be a way to avoid that, as this is actually a two-player game, and if player 2 is still alive, I would assume you could just coin back in at any point, but I don't fully remember and didn't have a player 2 to test with while recording this. Overall, I really like the game. Despite its difficulty, I have a bunch of nostalgia for it. So much so that I bought it on the Wii Virtual Console and was one of their first arcade releases, and still have a lot of fun playing it, but I mean, the NES port is pretty much a masterpiece. So I don't think I have to say too much about it because yeah, it's pretty great, but I do want to talk about what they did change, which was essentially everything, and why that makes this a much better game. First off, the change in gameplay style from beat 'em up to side-scrolling action platformer was a bold move. I mean, they completely changed the game. They tore it down to its foundation of just a ninja and made essentially a brand new game. I'm sure some of this had to do with graphical limitations in having the large characters from the beat-em-up on screen, as well as the complex movements and attacks of the characters, but it works honestly so much better. The action is faster and smoother and makes me feel more like a ninja running through a wave of enemies. The challenge, like I mentioned, is greatly improved, as now it's more about complicated platforming and learning the enemy patterns instead of trying not to position yourself awkwardly between multiple enemies so you mercilessly get the shit kicked out of you unavoidably. Also, they completely changed the story to the game, and in such a big way. Ninja Gaiden revolutionized how video games told stories as a medium, adding the cinematic cutscenes between levels to move forward the narrative and tie the levels together in a way we had never seen before. They did sort of keep one other thing, as the first stage in the NES game is a loose translation of the first street stage from the arcade game, enough to make the arcade fans feel a little at home while experiencing this bold journey they were about to go on. All in all, they took a pretty cool side-scrolling beat-em-up and turned it into something completely different that became a generational video game franchise. Punch-Out is another staple game on the NES, but actually started its life in the arcade in 1984. Honestly, it's a very strange arcade game that used a double screen, like the DS. They were determined to make this idea work eventually. Now when I say used a double screen, I will put an asterisk on that, because the second screen really didn't do anything, and was merely used to show statistics and stuff. Totally not necessary to the gameplay in any way. You don't play as Little Mac, but a green wireframe boxer who you enter 3 initials to name. The wireframe concept allowed your character to be full size while still being able to fully see the opponent at all times, so you could notice the subtle cues for their upcoming strikes. Timing is everything, of course, in this game, as you watch how the opponent moves and their eyes to determine the best times to counter-strike. There are more powerful attacks than your standard left and right punches that are unlocked by hitting enough consecutive punches to build up the KO meter. You use a separate button to then unleash these strikes and hopefully knock your opponent down for the count. These matches consist of just one round and you win by knockout only. There isn't a TKO per se, but if you knock your opponent down 3 times in a single round, he will not get up by the 10 count. If the timer on the round runs out, you automatically lose as there is no decision to these fights. Remember, the idea was to make quarters. The roster should be pretty familiar to those familiar with the NES game, as several classic boxers are here like Glass Joe and Bald Bull that went on to become iconic Punch-Out characters and continued in the series for years to come. Overall, it's a really fun game, and I remember playing it a bunch as it was for some reason the only arcade game at our local airport for a while when I was younger, but when compared to the NES game, it just isn't as fun. Punch-Out on the NES is essentially the same game with some modifications to port it to a less powerful system, as well as some tweaks to the gameplay that make it much, and I mean much more enjoyable. First thing worth mentioning is of course Iron Mike Tyson. I mean, this move was brilliant because you have a boxing game and immediately add the inclusion of the greatest boxer in the world at that time, and you have a recipe for success. Not only did he add legitimacy to the game, but it pumped everyone up to go one-on-one with the baddest man on the planet. Also, you now have an official hero as the nameless wireframe was replaced by Little Mac. Little Mac was necessary as Punch-Out only really works if you can see your opponent to understand what moves are coming, and since the wireframe component wasn't going to work well on the NES, they decided to use a shrunk-down character that took up minimal space on the screen, and for whatever reason, it just resonated better. I mean, we could all identify with a small character because we were kids ourselves and we could see ourselves in him, and plus, who doesn't love an underdog story? The fights changed as well, as now there were 3 rounds instead of 1. This allowed a between round section that kinda showed off the info displayed on the top screen of the dual screen display in the arcades, but told a fun story itself. And we got sometimes helpful advice from Doc. The fights were also broke up into circuits consisting of a few boxers and different champions as opposed to the arcade where it was just one long streak of competitors. At the end of each circuit, we got a cool Rocky-inspired training montage and a password to continue at that point. The in-ring action changed considerably as well, as the KO counter was replaced with a star system where super punches were rewarded for appropriately timed counter punches instead of just building up repeated strikes. This added a really cool element to the gameplay, as you could no longer just punch to try and knock the person down, but you had to strategize your fights to counterpunch when necessary based on precision timing. It really is a thing of beauty. Both games are great, and sure, the arcade of course has better graphics, but even then I prefer the look of the characters on the NES. This one isn't even close, it's 100% the NES port every time for me. Of the NES ports compared to the arcade originals, this will be the closest one we discuss today, and in more ways than one. I didn't even know there was a Contra Arcade game when I was a kid, and was only familiar with the great version on the NES. When I first got my Xbox 360 and saw Contra listed under Xbox Arcade, I picked it up immediately, and well, I was a little underwhelmed, to be honest. Contra Arcade definitely scores marks for its aesthetics, as the graphics are so much better than the NES version. There is no debating that, but everything else it does just a little shittier. First of all, there is the screen size, and for whatever reason, Contra Arcade is displayed on a vertical screen. This means that there is a shorter distance to see while side-scrolling, and really impacts how you view enemies and projectiles on the screen. This is the first of the really odd choices. The second is the music, which is there, but just sounds different. I love Konami music in the arcades, and love isn't a strong enough word, but the music just sounds off here. The gameplay is probably the biggest disappointment, as it isn't as fast and smooth as I remember from the NES. It honestly feels like I'm moving in slow motion, if that makes sense. There are also some pretty major differences in the way the game plays. One would be the tunnel sections after the first platforming stage. Instead of it being a straightforward tunnel, there are twists and turns and you don't auto-scroll. Not a major difference, but worth noting all the same. The next issue I want to point out is the bosses are a little different. Specifically the Stage 3 boss, and it just isn't as fun. In fact, that's the perfect statement to be made about the arcade version in comparison. The NES version is platforming perfection. It's the perfect example of a fun but super hard and rewarding game. It's challenging but controls really well, and the challenge is from skill and memorization and not difficulty seeing where projectiles are coming from or slow and awkward character control. The music is iconic, and the NES nails how this music should sound. Maybe I'm looking at this through nostalgia-colored glasses, or maybe headphones, but the NES music just sounds better. I'll let you judge for yourself, but that's my opinion. The stages seem a little bit longer, and it looks just so much better through a wider perspective as we can see more clearly what's coming and what paths we should take. The characters and enemies might not look quite as good as they do in the arcade version, but I will tell you they don't look bad, and certainly move 100 times better. It just no longer feels like I am moving through molasses, and I can quickly move my character out of harm's way or into the perfect position to pick up a power-up or take down an enemy. Really, what I want to say more than anything else is that this is a pretty close to the arcade port on the NES that was made better by not changing the genre of the game or making massive changes to the way the game plays and is displayed, but just by fine-tuning the experience for the home market. I can have the Contra Arcade experience at home and enjoy it so much more without even having to drop a quarter. So guys, those are just a couple NES games that are ported from arcade games that I think are actually better than the arcade games they were made from. You guys may agree with me, may disagree with me, feel free to let me know in the comments, and more than anything else, I know that these aren't the only NES games ported from the arcade that might be a little bit better than the arcade games themselves, so feel free to let me know in the comments if there's other games you think I missed or other games I should include in future video. I really appreciate it. Anyways guys, thank you very much for watching today's video. This is MichaelBtheGameGenie, and I'll talk to you next time.